Hi, my name's Dasa Brynjolffssen and I'm from PwC. I'm a director there. Well, I'm a recent mover to the island. I've been here on the island about a year or so, working at PwC here in audit, accounting and corporate reporting. But before then, I was with PwC, so the same company, but in London. So a relatively recent recruit to the Isle of Man, although as I sit here gazing over Douglas Bay, it doesn't seem like such a bad thing at all, albeit Port Erin's a little bit smaller than London.
Oh, yeah. Well, what about the weather? It's a nice day today.
Yeah, can't complain about the weather when it's like today.
Do you complain about the weather when it's not a good day compared
all the time?
I'm glad to see it's not just me. And I was born here. PwC, of course, professional services firm, known to a lot of people. What sort of size on the Isle of Man are we talking about?
There are about 115 of us here on the Isle of Man from actually a huge number of places. It's one of the things that pleased me immensely when I joined. I feel like there's something like 15 nationalities amongst 115 people. Uganda, Nigeria, Jamaica, China, Spain, Ireland. It's brilliant. It really resonates with me. It makes it a very exciting and dynamic place to work. And we've got tax advisors, accountants, auditors, so a professional services firm, corporate reporting consultants such as myself, really trying to support businesses in a whole host of ways. And I've been at PwC a long time now. It's one of the places, the reason that I've stuck there is a place that really gels. The values PwC has really kind of gel with me. So it's all about doing the right thing, working together and really trying to make a difference. And that's kind of why we're sitting here today talking about the ESG agenda. PwC's purpose generally is about building trust in society and solving important problems, quote unquote. And that really does play into ESG, as we're going to talk about now. And
ESG is it unfair to call it one of the buzzwords in modern business parlance?
It's not unfair at all. One of, if not the, buzzwords in modern business parlance. Stands for environmental, social and governance, but I'm not sure that gives any more idea as to what it actually means. People often try to get a handle on what it means. And often people use it as synonymous with climate change and doing the right thing to do with climate change, but it's actually far broader than that. It's really about businesses acting responsibly, facing the challenges that we as global citizens in the world face. One of the things that I sort of like to do when I'm explaining it to people is try and boil it down to an individual level. And you say, well, you know, everyone listening here will have heard of Greta Thunberg. Then she's really brought the climate change agenda up front in people's minds. Or the murder of George Floyd, which brought racial inequality right back up on the agenda and the forefront. And we're all being challenged ourselves as individuals by this stuff. Look at what's going on in the world. There are issues here. What can we do about it? What should we be doing about it? How do we act differently to make these things better? And it's that sort of underlying feeling that really pushes the ESG agenda first from individuals and then into the business world. And it's sort of interesting to reflect. I imagine a lot of people listening to this will be doing things differently now than they did 5 or 10 years ago. And that's exactly the nub of what we're talking about here. Maybe driving an electric car when you didn't before. Maybe watching food miles. Where am I buying food from? I want to buy local. Or maybe taking part in the Isle of Man Pride event, or doing something community focused. And we're doing this stuff, and you've got to ask yourself, well, yeah, I am doing something different, and why is that? And I think it's because we're all putting a bit more pressure on ourselves to act a bit more responsibly and play into these global issues. Me personally, it's about meat. I'm trying to eat a little bit less meat. I haven't gone full veggie, but I'm trying to eat veggie a couple of days a week, which has its challenges when I live with a very carnivorous other half and 2 very meat-loving young boys. But that's something that I'm choosing to do, and I'm doing it because it's part of this wider agenda. And I think we're all making these asks of ourselves, and that is just translating to the business world. And we say, okay, well, if I'm asking this of myself, what about the company I work for? What about the companies I buy things from? What about the companies I choose to interact with my business? Who should I buy things from? And so it sort of pushes from that personal agenda into a more corporate sphere.
Has this been driven, would you say, by clients rather than by the business? Is it that clients are expecting businesses like PwC to be more environmentally conscious now?
I think it's clients, yes. Companies, yes, meaning their owners or their employees. It actually comes from a huge breadth of stakeholders because, like I said, it's actually driven by individual people expecting a little bit more of themselves. So customers will look at a business and think, well, it's on my mind that I want to be more environmentally friendly. So if I'm going to choose between buying from two different companies offering something similar, if I can see that one of them has an agenda where they want to do something more for the environment in terms of their waste, reducing the waste that they produce, I'm going to choose to buy from them. So some of it comes from customers, some of it comes from employees. I've sat in many a recruitment interview, and that bit at the end of the interview where you ask the potential employee, well, have you got any questions for me? And they'll ask and say, well, what are you doing on diversity? What are you doing on waste reduction? And that never used to be a thing. But it's certainly a thing now. Recruits will choose which company to go and work for based on they're looking for something kind of like me saying earlier, I want a company that gels with my values. And if this company isn't interested in this and I am, maybe this isn't the right company for me.
So it is in many ways a product of changing times, and we all know time never stands still, values never stand still. We're always expecting more, thinking differently about how we approach life and business in general. Now, I suppose in this particular case, you mentioned a few personal, you can take ESG down to a personal level. At a business level, how does it actually translate then to businesses, whether they're sort of big multinationals like PwC or perhaps on the Isle of Man, small individual or family businesses?
It does translate, and it's that ask that we make of ourselves, and we're making it of companies. And it's a question of understanding, I think, what impact the business does have on some of these wider issues, societal or environmental issues, and then what actions are within the company's control, or what could you do that would be different and would make a positive effort there. And there's a real push from stakeholders more generally and society generally for companies to be measured not just by financial performance. A company is a good company if it makes money, but actually non-financial performance as well. Well, okay, so what are you doing from a broader non-financial perspective in terms of ESG type topics? And there's a push for businesses to communicate what they're thinking. What are the issues that matter? What are their objectives? What are they going to do about it? And then how they actually progress against that. How do you measure progress? This is our objective. We're going to cut carbon emissions in half. We're part way there. We're all the way there. This is the trajectory we're on. So there's a huge push for businesses to do that. And it's not just a box ticking exercise. It really does pull through into adding value to businesses. And we see that, you can see companies will find it easier to find new customers. They may find it easier to find other businesses to work with because these other businesses want to work with companies with similar values to theirs. They may find it easier to recruit and retain staff, as I was saying earlier. So it really is tried and tested that it can actually be hugely beneficial to have a thought out ESG agenda and strategy.
Is this something of a sea change, do you think, in recent years? Because you can correct me if I'm wrong in this, but I think a lot of people might have had the perception that large multinationals like sort of PwC or bigger business consultancy firms, accountants, you mentioned they're making a profit, and they might have thought, well, that's really their sole interest is the bottom line.
Yeah, it is. It is. And don't get me wrong, there will be some companies here where they might look at the ESG agenda and decide that actually it isn't as important to their stakeholders as making money. But that's becoming fewer and further between. You actually find stakeholders, and I use that to mean investors, it can be lenders, employees, customers, suppliers. There is more of a focus from all of these people that actually where's a balance. It doesn't have to be, you have to throw everything, all your time and effort into some kind of environmental metric or target to the detriment of making financial profits. That wouldn't work for the majority of companies. It's about finding, well, how much money, time, effort, investment do we want to put into this such that we feel like we're doing the right thing, and balancing that with other strategic priorities.
Are people, you think, really on board with it now? Because I guess with any of these ideas coming through, there's always a slight resistance to change, I guess. And for some, particularly if something's become a buzzword like ESG, they'll just think, this is just box ticking.
Yeah, that is very much true. And I also think as well that people look at it and say, well, goodness, we're a car manufacturer. Of course, we use up a lot of energy. What do you want me to do? I can't stop manufacturing cars. But it's not about that. It's about really kind of digging into, for each company, well, what are the issues where you are making an impact? And then what are the actions that can reasonably be taken to make a difference? Listen to me, I'm not going full vegetarian, and I haven't turned into Greta Thunberg, and I'm not going to. but I'm trying to make a difference myself at an individual level, which I know is an improvement on where I was before, even if it's not kind of going to best in class. And I think that's important. I think companies out there, it's a difficult nut to crack. And sometimes as well, the breadth of the topic, I think, gets people a bit het up. Oh, I can't become this perfectly green company, therefore we're not going to do anything at all. Well, actually, it's not about that. It's about working out where you can make a difference within your broader business strategy, demonstrating and communicating to the external stakeholders out there that you have thought about it. This is what I'm doing. This is why it makes sense. And then actually you will get that kind of added value and buy-in from external stakeholders.
Do companies need convincing then, in as much as, yes, they are out to make money, and Lord knows in the current financial times, it's not that easy a task, particularly for a lot of small and medium-sized firms, and maybe perhaps the larger multinationals are a bit more cushioned from increasing prices across the board at the moment, and people can say, well, it's all very well, I like the idea, but how is this going to benefit our company overall?
There's been surveys and research done out there, companies IPO, for example, so list on a stock exchange, and if they have a robust strategy around ESG, there are percentage points more of value generated on that listing. It's because people see this as important for the longer term. So potential investors will see a difference. That really adds some value. There are lenders out there who will lend to you cheaper financing if you can demonstrate that you're meeting certain criteria around certain environmental standards, for example. So there absolutely is of value to companies to think about this stuff. And it's also worth bearing in mind, there are a lot of companies out there where it's not just a question of adding value to the company, it also becomes something that can be mandated. So there are various jurisdictions. The Isle of Man is not one. I'm sure we'll come on to that in a bit. But various jurisdictions where there are certain ESG focuses being mandated from governments, from regulators, or from other kind of external bodies, saying, well, actually, you know what? Climate change is vitally important. The UK is really pushed on climate change for large companies there, and companies there are required to report on carbon emissions, large private companies and all public companies. What are your carbon emissions? What are your targets to reduce it? How is that going? That's been there for years. So that's just an example, but it's really, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, certain companies now are being required to think about the issues, the strategy, their objectives, their actions, and sort of report on that publicly.
So how does this actually work then for big multinationals like PwC? You're mentioning the different governance where it might be. So does that mean PwC Singapore might be operating to different ESG standards to PwC Isle of Man?
It's a good question. We have PwC globally has certain targets, including, for example, net zero by 2030 is one of the global targets, which is then pushed down into the local jurisdictions. And to some degree, we're at our own remit to work out how we're going to achieve that. Interestingly, here on the Isle of Man, we've struggled with some of we're required to also cut our carbon emissions by half, which is quite difficult when we didn't have that many in the first place. We were actually a pretty green firm here on the Isle of Man in the first place, compared to, say, I don't know, some of the other jurisdictions where, for example, they had a lot of business travel and things like that, which we just don't have here. That's not to say that we're not going to do it. We just have to get a bit more inventive in how you go about things. But yeah, so the PwC objectives around climate, primarily in terms of net zero, but also recycling and reduction in carbon emissions, and also a really strong focus for us around diversity and inclusion, so ethnic and gender being two cases in point. And that plays to what I was saying earlier about what a breadth of ethnicities and nationalities we have in our office, right, which is wonderful. But we've just had a really big investment of some inclusion and diversity training that everyone went through to try and teach us to be a bit more open-minded maybe, and recognise when sometimes unconscious bias can creep into your decision making and things like that. It's been really quite eye-opening. It's funny, you can think you know a lot about this stuff, but there's a lot of eye-opening information out there. So that's been a big investment on the PwC side of things.
Is it going to vary, and coming back to the Isle of Man, obviously where we are as we're talking today here at Manx Radio, is it going to be, there's not a great deal, as I understand it, of regulations put into place on the Isle of Man with regards to ESG, but in other jurisdictions, say, like I said, parts of Asia or Australia or the States, it's something that could be very different?
Yeah, and I will steer clear of any political statement about whether it's a good or bad thing, but it is a fact that at this point in time, there's no specified regulation here on the Isle of Man in terms of companies doing any ESG type reporting, collecting any data like that. And it's interesting because it provides, on one hand, it provides an opportunity. It means there's a lot of flexibility here for companies to identify what they think is important and then react to that themselves without having something mandated on them saying, actually, for you, one of the two things you have to think about must be gender pay diversity, for example, or whatever it may be. So it brings with it flexibility. What's interesting is, despite there being a lack of regulation, we are seeing companies here react. It's not that everyone's sitting on their laurels. Companies here are reacting. They are doing something. They're thinking about this, developing their strategies and so on. But then that comes back to the point I've been making, which is that's because the societal push and the push from stakeholders remains, whether or not there's governmental regulation to sort of cement that in or force that in a certain direction. So we see companies doing things. First and foremost, it's a challenge to embark on in the first place. So companies need to have those conversations with their stakeholders, try and work out what those significant so-called material issues are, and then where they want to be with that. Do we want to be best in class? Do we want to be just making a small difference? Do we want to be somewhere in the middle? How much time and investment are we going to put into this? So we're seeing companies embark upon this. What we're seeing as well is that actually it's hard. The breadth of the topic you're dealing with is so vast. The potential actions you can take are so many that honing in on, well, what is the right thing to do is actually quite difficult. And, not every company is filled to the brim of environmental experts or religious diversity experts or whatever it may be, right? So you see companies tapping into external help sometimes just to help them frame their ideas. That's how we come across it ourselves from a PwC perspective. Now, we were talking earlier about PwC's own agenda in this space. I talked a little bit about net zero, things we're doing, but the other important facet of our own strategy is to help other companies get on the board with this stuff. And by that way, we help the wider agenda by getting other companies to think about this, to move in this space, to start making a positive difference. Sort of virtuous circle, if you will.
You get the impression the more we talk about it, it is such a broad topic. I think you're right. A lot of people might just associate it with climate change elements, but it's more really about perhaps more caring working in many ways, being more inclusive, thinking more about people's lifestyle, integrating with the communities in which you're embedded, in which you're working and such like, all sorts of different elements there. Are people readily buying into this? Is there still some resistance on the basis that you get the impression, at least I get the impression, if we were having this conversation in 20 years' time, it would just be the norm. We wouldn't be talking about it. It'd just be what happens.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. There is resistance. Maybe resistance is the wrong word for it, but pushback maybe at two levels. One of them being, this isn't important for businesses. This isn't what businesses are for. I feel like that's maybe a little bit taking an ostrich head in the sand approach to things, because I think actually society is changing and individuals that you operate with are changing, their expectations are changing, and regulation will come here on the Isle of Man, I'm sure of that. So putting that piece aside, you then kind of deal with it, maybe that there's some resistance when you try and make some changes. It's interesting. Everyone agrees, yes, it would be great if the company operated in a more environmentally friendly way, but I do still want to get my annual business trip to New York because I really like it when I go over there, and I'd rather not do it on Zoom. Or, well, that's all well and good, but I do quite like having 3 monitors on my desk rather than just having one. So actually when it comes down to there are actions that need to be taken here and it may not be as convenient to you as it used to be, then you can face some resistance. And the difficulty is, there's no change without change at the end of the day. I say this to the kids when they say, well, yeah, we wanted to do this veggie thing, but I quite fancy some sausages tonight. Like, well, no, boys, that's not how it works. You have to say what you're going to do and then do what you said you would do. It's important, therefore, it comes right back to the beginning. If you get the right buy-in from people early on, if you've gauged people's views, got them to input into what are we going to do? Okay, let's all embark on this and do it together. If you've got that buy-in at the start, then you'll still face a resistance, but hopefully you can deal with it and kind of work through that rather than just hitting a brick wall.
So it's definitely not one size fits all by any stretch of the imagination. What can businesses do then? People listening to this, perhaps they are, again, a small or medium-sized business, a small family business, a local business. That doesn't let them, or at least I don't think that means they should think, this doesn't apply to us. But perhaps it's a case of, how does this apply to us?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would encourage people to start thinking about it. Don't be afraid of the magnitude of the topic in a way. Actually, hopefully, as I've explained it today, it's easier to kind of break it down into, it can be smaller chunks. It can be actually what you want it to be and what fits for your business. The most difficult thing is sitting down and thinking, right, where do I start? What do I care about as a business? Where does my business impact the environment or society? And what actions are within my control to change that might make a positive difference there? It makes a lot of sense to look to others. As I said, there are other businesses out there who may be far larger than your business, but they might operate in a similar sphere, and they will already be reporting on this kind of thing. You can look to the UK, you can look to the US. There are companies who are reporting what their strategies are, what issues they consider to be relevant to them, and then what objectives they set themselves and how they're measuring that. And that's not to say that if I have a dairy cattle business and I look at a great big listed company and they say, well, they're focusing on X, doesn't have to mean it's right for me, but it's interesting food for thought as you're coming to your own thought process. There really is no right and wrong. It's about setting an objective that makes sense, that's proportionate and practical in terms of the sphere that you're sitting in, but is a bit different to what you were doing before. It really is the single most difficult thing for companies to grapple with as part of this agenda, is starting from this massive topic and filtering it down to 2 or 3 things you think, right, this is something that I can do or we can do collectively. It will make a difference, and it's going to give us an answer to that question when someone asks me in a job interview, or when someone asks a customer, well, what are you doing on ESG? You've actually got a response, and it's not a vague response. It's a very specific, thought out, well, this is what's happening and this is why. And that makes a big difference.
And is that, you think, the most important tip for someone in a small business who's maybe not so far really gone down the ESG route? Is it to actually get together, or with whoever is there at the sort of management level in the first instance, and think, okay, what can we do to start, and what can we identify within this business that we can actually do, rather than trying to be all-encompassing and taking everything in, thinking, right, what do we do? What could we do as a starting point to actually start going down this ESG route?
Yeah, I think that's exactly spot on. Exactly spot on. And, at the risk of sounding like I'm just here as a marketing ploy, because I'm not, but getting some advice from someone else who's been through that process themselves, or through a professional services firm such as PwC, can make a big difference, just to help you start to formulate your thoughts as to where you want to go on this journey, and then how you can actually generate some value from that by publicising what you've been doing and trying to differentiate yourself in the market from the actions that you're taking. It's a very good idea. I think we've got a lot of information on our website. There is a landing page. It's pwc.com/IM/ESG. Very snappy title, but easy to find.
It is.
Yeah, and there's information on there about the wider ESG agenda, but also information about how to contact myself, other specialists within PwC who will be very happy to help. This is a kind of topic that takes a lot of debating to start to formulate ideas, and the more voices involved in this topic, the better.
It is, as you say, a massive topic, and we've chatted away for half an hour and we've probably barely scratched the surface of the topic overall. But I think it's a case of, as you're saying, rather than being afraid of it, just identify perhaps some small element, taking a small step and starting there.
Exactly so.
Are you going to go green entirely then?
First, I've got to get the boys to eat something that's not a sausage. Let me start with that.